This is a real pleasure, not only because I recognize so many faces out here of people that I consider to be friends of mine that I've known over the years, but being in Wellesley is actually sort of special to me. Just up the road, the Wellesley Inn is where I spent my wedding night over 40 years ago. There'll be no more details than that, but I do have a special place in my heart for Wellesley. In addition, I get, this isn't coffee, I get MWRA water, which you all know is the best water in North America. It's too bad more people don't know that, but what I'd like to do today is I'm going to talk for a while. I'll keep looking at the clock so I don't go too long, because I could probably go 3 or 4 hours talking about this stuff if my voice lasted. Talk about the various issues that are on the outline here. Let me encourage people to raise hands, ask questions as we go ahead. Don't be shy. I know a lot of you, and I know a lot of you aren't shy. What I thought I would start talking about first is some of the water pricing standards, that type of stuff. This is the old, well, it's not old anymore, I guess. It's the EOEA and Water Resource Commission Water Conservation Standards. It was first put out in 2006. It was updated a little bit in 2012. And it's going through a review right now as to what those standards will be within the Commonwealth, as they have to do with many things having to do with conservation, but particularly things that I'm most interested in and I get most involved in with metering, pricing, that type of stuff, and I am on the panel that's working on that, and I'll give you a little bit of insight about some of that. But I thought first what I would do is go through some of the stuff that's in there right now that are in those standards, having to do with metering. Things like 100% metering is the standard. Step back. Standards are things that you're supposed to do. On these recommendations are things they would like you to do, and they will stay with standards and recommendations. But the standards include 100% metering, including municipal accounts. And I know a lot of people don't charge your municipal accounts. It's difficult with Proposition 2.5 sometimes to get money out of the general fund, but you are supposed to be at least metering all of your municipal accounts. It also has a standard for at least quarterly billing. Now, when I used to buy water in the town I lived in, I got my water bill every 6 months. I thought that was the strangest thing, that I'd get a water bill every 6 months. The standard in the Commonwealth right now is quarterly meeting. And it was interesting. I looked at the Ty and Bond study, and still 34% of the communities in Massachusetts are billing less frequently than quarterly. I know there's a number of you that are billing monthly. There's certainly a trend to go to monthly billing, and I think I've probably told a number of people in this room 10 years from now when we're talking, everybody's going to be billing monthly, and that's something that I know is difficult because there's a cost involved with it, but it's something that's going to happen. It's a very quick story. I work on the AWWA manuals on water rates, and we put out one on small systems some years ago, and we were first putting it out. They were talking about metering, and they were showing monthly metering, and I said, what's this monthly metering? Small systems don't bill monthly. And everybody from around the country looked at me like I had two heads and said, what do you mean you don't bill monthly? And I said, well, no, it's, quarterly, semi-annual, and how often you get your electric bill in Massachusetts, your gas bill, your phone, and everybody's heard this before. It was just strange, the reaction around the rest of the country, and it's sort of a New England Northeast thing that we don't bill more frequently, but I think it's something you certainly will be seeing, and it gives a lot more flexibility and ability to do things with water rates and sewer rates if you are billing monthly. There are metering recommendations. Again, these aren't standards that are in that manual now. Funding meter replacement, reading and billing large users monthly is the recommendation. Sharing the cost between water and sewer of the billing if you're billing on water consumption for sewer. Reporting usage in gallons, that's an interesting one. I suspect that most of you are still billing in 100 cubic feet, which is a really odd thing. I mean, most of your customers have no idea what, what's 100 in cubic feet? 750 gallons even, you can say that. People don't understand what that is, and it's, I saw a video the other day, it was done by, I think, somewhere in Arizona, where they asked customers, the man on the street interview, what do you pay per gallon for water? $5, $10, $3, blah, 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 all of that. Nobody could comprehend that they were paying less than a penny a gallon for water. But we charge in 100 cubic feet, which people don't understand, and don't understand how what a great deal they get for the water that you provide them all. Using remote meter reading is another one of the recommendations. As far as pricing, the two standards that are in there right now are full cost pricing, whatever that means. That's somewhat nebulous, I understand, and the prohibition against decreasing block water rates. That's actually in the general laws, that prohibition against the decreasing block water rates. It's Chapter 40, Section 39L of the general laws that prohibit decreasing block water rates. As far as recommendations for pricing that are in the current conservation standards, there's language about encouraging efficient use, discouraging non-essential use. I'm not sure anybody's ever really defined what non-essential use is. I think that's a big issue, and it goes to the whole pricing and what you're trying to accomplish with pricing. I mean, the example I throw out there is golf course watering. Is that a non-essential use? It's a recreational use. If you're not a golfer, it's clearly a non-essential use. If you are a golfer, it probably is an essential use. But it goes to the question about what about maintaining stream flows for kayakers, another recreational use. Is kayaking more important than golfing? And it gets into all of those issues about what's essential or non-essential. It goes into agricultural. Is growing agricultural products that require large amounts of irrigation to grow, is that an essential use of water, or should we be having agricultural products that are more native and don't require large amounts of water? Things like that I don't think are really getting addressed when we look at essential and non-essential, and probably should be. Anyways, there are two types of rate structures that are in the standards now: increasing block rates, which I'll talk about a little bit, and seasonal rates. There's the establishment of enterprise accounts or enterprise funds is another recommendation, and the assessment of environmental costs. Again, whatever those are, and those are pretty poorly defined. I think we probably all have some ideas of what they are, but I guess if there's 100 people in the room, there's 100 different ideas of what the environmental costs are. These are all under review right now. Let me emphasize, none of this has been finalized. We're still going through meetings, and the guidance is being updated. Things that are being talked about in May, let me emphasize May. This isn't cast in stone by any means yet because we're still having discussions, but things that may be included in the new guidance would be to include more emphasis on seasonal rates and less emphasis on increasing block rates. One of the problems with increasing block rates, those are rates where the more you use, the higher the rate, and they're intended to discourage large volumes of water use. One of the problems with them when they're applied across the board to all your customers is they tend to penalize deep pockets, the very large users, the Gillettes, the large water users are the ones that tend to buy all their water in the higher blocks. It also gets into issues about apartment buildings that have a master meter that just by their very nature will end up in the higher rate blocks and paying much more just because they have an apartment building. Now, I know a lot of you have done that. There's people in Medford here that have just instituted an increasing block rate, and what they and other towns do, Watertown I know does, is looks at some of the multifamilies and say, okay, if I've got 10 units, I'm going to divide the consumption by the 10 units and figure out what the consumption per unit is, figure out your rate there, and then multiply by 10. So it eliminates sort of that penalty of having a master meter. That's becoming more and more common. Difficult to do, hard to implement, hard to administer, but it's something that people are starting to do. And it points up part of the problems with increasing block rates. I think one of the leading cases in law that came about this, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not giving anybody legal advice, is there was a case in Malden, oh boy, it must have been 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago now, where a large apartment owner, developer, sued the town when they put in increasing block rates and said, hey, not fair. I have a big master meter, I have 100 units in my apartment buildings, all my water use essentially is at that highest block. I am not the problem in Malden, it's the people with single-family homes and large lawns. I don't use any water for irrigation from the municipal system. All my water is from wells. Didn't have any pools, and I'm a very low water user, but just because I have a master meter, I end up paying more with the increasing block rates. What also happened in Malden at the time is people with single-family homes and large lawns ended up actually getting a decrease in their water bills because of the shift in the burden from the smaller user to the large developer. And it ended up lowering the cost to the people with big lawns. And I don't think there's anybody in the room that would suggest that doing that is going to encourage water conservation, but that was the purpose of what they did in Malden and why they did it. It sounds like I'm calling out Malden, I'm not. You know that many of you are in this room are in that same situation. Increasing block rates don't always encourage water conservation if they're applied universally to everybody. And more people, particularly outside of New England, are doing increasing block rates that vary by customer class, vary by meter size, apply to only residential, trying to make sure that the higher charges for people that have large lawns that they're watering are indeed paying the higher charges. And just because you happen to be a laundromat or a car wash or a restaurant that uses a lot of water, that you're not necessarily penalized because you're using a lot of water and needlessly encouraging savings that aren't there. I suspect that the new regulations are going to discuss increasing block rates more in those lights as something that is not being as pushed as much as it has been in the past, and instead seasonal rates will be something that come in more. And those are rates where you have a different higher rate generally in the summer when your demand is highest, lower in the winter time. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and I can get into that if you want, on how you do that. But I think there's probably going to be more emphasis on seasonal rates, which is interesting because there really aren't very many of them in the Commonwealth. I think, I don't know, Acton, Chatham, one or two others in the Commonwealth that have some sort of a seasonal rate. Something I think you will probably all be hearing more about, particularly as these standards come out, and there gets to be more emphasis on seasonal rates. Let's see what else is in there. The strong language about prohibiting decreasing block rates will probably be changed a bit to say more about encouraging pricing standards to reduce inefficient, non-essential uses. More reliance on that language than just don't use decreasing block rates that are in the guidance now. The other thing that's really interesting out of this is I think there's probably going to be some language in there about fixed costs and fixed revenues. 10, 15 years ago, there was a big move to make all of your charges consumption-based, encourage conservation, raise the price. The more you use, the higher the price. Make it hurt if you're going to water your lawn on a day like this. The problem of that, and I know all of you have seen that, is that in doing that, and particularly with increasing block rates, you end up charging that marginal use at the highest rate. And if you have a summer, it's like today, and people aren't watering their lawn as much, it's that high-priced water that's reduced first. And that has a big impact. A 10% reduction in water use might mean a 20% reduction in revenues, because it's the high-priced water that people aren't using first, or they're cutting back on first. And that's what you were trying to do with conservation rates. It's not a surprise that happens. But then you run into the problem. You ask your customers to save water, reduce consumption. You put in rates to discourage wasteful use of water. They go ahead and do what you say, and they say, oh, well, consumption's down, I got to raise the water and sewer rates again. And they say, wait a minute, I did what you said, and now you're penalizing me by raising the rates. The whole notion that if I raise the rates 10%, you reduce your consumption 10%, your bill doesn't change, is generally lost on the customers. It's generally lost on the communities that are setting the rates, on the boards that are setting that. But that's gone, and all they see is increasing rates with reduced consumption. So I think the new guidance may have some more emphasis on more fixed costs. Both water and sewer are generally fixed-priced entities. Where you are all MWRA, half, two-thirds of your costs are MWRA charges, and you can say those aren't fixed. In the short run, they are. They're all based on what happened in prior years. And if you sell no water, you're still going to get the same bill from the MWRA for water and sewer. You might feel it a year or two down the road. But in general, almost all your costs are fixed. Very few costs vary, and if you cut your water use by 20%, your costs of running your water and sewer operations are not going to go down 20%. You'd be lucky if they go down 1% with a drop in use, at least in the current year, or for a year or two. Because of that, there's been some more emphasis on more fixed charge to stabilize revenue so that you have a better idea of what you're going to get from year to year. And that's sort of a turnaround from what everybody was doing 15, 20 years ago. California, you hear about a lot with water and sewer rates because of the problems. They have no water. It's as simple as that. And they're doing some very, very complicated things with their water and sewer charges. But even in California, that probably leads a lot of the conservation standards, I'll call them, are allowing up to 30% of their revenues from fixed charges. So I think you're going to start seeing a little bit more of that in the guidance too, that there'll be more of an emphasis on allowing more fixed charges. It's interesting because 30, 40 years ago, when I started into this, we used to have fire protection charges where the cost of providing fire protection in your water system was charged back to the general fund. The idea being that it's related to fire protection, you assess it to the general fund, it's paid through property taxes. If my house is worth $200,000 and Keith's house is worth $100,000, I pay twice as much in property taxes, but I get twice as much. He's excited about this. I get twice as much benefit, presumably, of fire protection than he does because my property is worth twice as much. It's not strictly true because land doesn't burn and structures burn and things like that. But in any case, those costs are generally in the 20 to 30% of your water system costs are providing capacity for fire protection. If you think of all the storage you have, the pumping, the pipes, they're all designed to meet fire demands, which are a big portion of your costs. And you know, unless you're the city of Boston, as I said, it's probably in that 20 to 30% range. In Boston, it's still a big number. I know Boston gets 3% of their revenues, water revenues, from private fire protection charges for sprinkler systems. So anyways, there's going to be more of that, and I think there'll be a return more to doing that. And there's been more and more lately around the country of trying to address what the fire protection costs of water are, assessing those as a fixed charge based on meter size or structure value. They do in Concord, New Hampshire, things like that. Messaging is going to be another thing that'll probably come out. The value of water, the cost of water. It costs less than a penny a gallon. How much is it worth? I don't know how many people. Quick show of hands. How many people in this room have been without tap water for 24 hours? Oh, that's a fair number. I have always thought, you know, going to hearings and having reporters asking me questions afterwards and complaining about these huge increases that are coming there, I've challenged a number of reporters to turn off their tap. No drinking water, no flushing toilets, no shower, no watering of lawns, nothing. You can buy all the bottled water you want and flush your toilets with that, but no tap water for 24 hours. And if any of them could do it, I would pay their next water bill. No one's ever taken me up on that. It's difficult if you don't have water. It's, you know, walking down to the river, filling a bucket to flush the toilet is not fun, particularly if it's cold out, if it's raining out. But so I think there's going to be more in the way of messaging coming out to the public on the value of water, the value of conservation, the value of long-term planning for your water supplies. And I think there'll be a more urgency on more frequent water billing coming out of the new regulations. Again, those are all May's. This is still in discussion. We're months away from the new standards, but those are the kinds of things that are being discussed at this point. Let me go a little bit to talk about rate structures. That's how you recover the costs of water and sewer departments. I looked at the tie and bond survey, which is nice because it talks to all 351 cities and towns and all of the water districts and all of that. It said that 65% of the communities or of the systems in Massachusetts have an increasing block rate. 34% have just a uniform charge, X dollars per 1,000 gallons, 100 cubic feet, that type of thing. There's a few, as I said, of the seasonals in there, but for the most part, everybody, 2/3 have increasing block water rates. I know one of the things that's come up a lot is the issue, and I think it was in one of the teasers that was sent out, because somebody called me about it, about the requirement, the law, that MWRA communities have increasing block water rates. It's Chapter 165, everybody's got pens, I'll say it again. Chapter 165, Section 2B, of 2B as in baseball, of the general laws of the Commonwealth. And it's pretty simple. It says, I'm going to read it to you. All municipalities or water districts within the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, but not including communities serviced by the Connecticut Valley Aqueduct, shall, not may, shall institute water charges and fees, so charges and fees, there's a distinction there, that incorporate a base rate for all users, provided that said base rate shall be increased at an increasing block rate to fairly reflect the resource, demand, and consumption of high-volume users of water. Perhaps it's not that artfully worded, but I think it's pretty clear as to what it says. It says you have to have increasing block water rates if you get water from the MWRA, unless you're in the Connecticut Valley part of the system. And yet a lot of communities don't. And part of the problem with it is who enforces this? I know it's come up in some towns. I won't call out any names, Bill. But it's come up as an issue, and the MWRA actually showed up at a meeting in this one town, I don't know, 10 years ago, and we don't know anything about it, and they were presented with the law, and they claim not to know about it, and I've mentioned it on a number of occasions, and the response seems to come back, it's not up to the authority to enforce the general laws of the Commonwealth, it's up to the Attorney General's office to enforce it, and if they're not going to enforce it, it's not up to us to do it. The authority has enough issues having to deal with all of you without having to be the cop on this thing. But the law is there. Now, I know there's some interpretations, and I've talked to Steve at the authority about this on a number of occasions. And it's, well, does it really mean that? Or, what does, more cost of water mean? Does that give us an out? And there's discussions like that. Frankly, I think it's pretty clear what it is. I'm surprised that some entity like, Sierra Club or Audubon Society hasn't brought an issue with this with the towns that don't do it. It really surprises me when this, litigious society that it hasn't come up. But the law's there, and I think it's pretty simple. And I gave you the reference. If you missed it, let me know, and I'll give it to you again. That you are supposed to have it. I don't know if that's going to change or if it will change. And I suspect if somebody brought a lawsuit, that might be one of the things that might bring some sort of a change, because the straight increasing block rate that is contemplated, I think, in this language, as I said earlier, doesn't necessarily address water conservation issues. In fact, it can be the antithesis of it, as I explained earlier in some cases. One of the other issues out there. I'm going to pause again, see if anybody wants to stretch their legs and go to the microphone for a question. Oh, there is somebody. Good.
I'm not being intimidated. I'm still confused. Can you get into a little more detail about how the block rates do not increase water conservation?
Sure.
I'm not clear on that.
Sure. It's really a function of where you set the different tiers and how you set them. And let's, for example, say a single-family home would, for indoor water use, would use, I'll make the number simple, 100 gallons a day, or 100 gallons per billing period, I'll call it. That's the average use for a home for indoor, we'll call it essential, whatever that means, water use. Then they set the rate above that for anything over 100 gallons a day at twice the first step. We just have the two steps to make it simple. So you got $1 for the 100 gallons and $2 for anything over that, and that's to encourage you not to use any water outside your home for non-essential uses. The problem then comes about when you have a three-person apartment right next door. Now, if they're each using 100 gallons a day indoor, they're already past the 100 and they use 300 in total. So they're now paying for a lot of water use at the higher rate, even though there's no external, no wasted, no non-essential use, they're paying for that. It gets exacerbated by a restaurant that may use 1,000 gallons a day and only gives water on demand and uses paper plates instead of dishes so they don't have to wash them, but still uses 1,000 gallons a day and is doing everything they can to conserve. And they're paying for 900 gallons at the higher rate, even though they're not doing anything. And then you get a large, a brewery that's using 10,000 gallons a day. And they don't waste any water, unless you think putting water in beer is a waste of water. But no, I'm seeing lots of shaking heads not agreeing with that idea. In that case, then the brewery is then paying for almost all of their water at that higher rate, and they may not be wasting any water at all. Every drop may go into the beer, and anything that's used for cleanup is recycled, and very little wasted water. But they're basically penalized just because they're a large user. Does that? Yes, I see you nodding. Okay. Anything else on any of that? Yes.
Yeah, Andy DeSantis, City of Chelsea. One of our largest water users is Came Foods. And I've had the discussion with Stefan Monkowitz, and I know they've done things to decrease their water use because of the cost of water, because of the ascending block rate, that otherwise I don't think would have happened. So I think there is some conservation value to an increasing block rate with a plant like that.
Sure. I don't mean to, Andy, it's a great point. I'm glad you said that. I don't mean to imply that there's not some value to it. I think I probably did more to champion increasing block water rates than just about anybody 30 years or so ago. I know when we did it in Boston, we were scared to death. When we first put it in Boston, there was going to be a lawsuit. Gillette was going to sue the Water and Sewer Commission. And I remember accumulating a pile of documents probably that high. This was at the time when the MWRA was over capacity and going to take all of the Connecticut River water or Merrimack River water and suck Western Massachusetts dry. All of that was going on. And we had accumulated a lot of stuff to protect against the lawsuit that we were sure was going to happen when Boston did it. And it was one of the first big entities to put in an increasing block rate. And I think you're right, Andy. It certainly has resulted in some water conservation. I think the question is who is it that's conserving and why are they conserving? In the case that you just mentioned, big water bill. And they use a lot of water, and sure, they're going to do anything and everything they can to reduce their consumption, which they should. I think just the rising cost of water would probably push them to that at some point in time, too. But I'm not sure it's doing anything to the people in Chelsea that have a lawn that never get into that second or third step, that are perhaps wasting more water than they were or are. I mean, it's almost a fairness issue. But you're right, you certainly do get, and I think we've seen, huge reductions in overall water use. Are we getting it because manufacturers are going south, leaving the country, leaving the area, and industrial and large commercial use is down, or are we getting it because people aren't growing golf greens on their lawn anymore? And that's sort of the thing that I'm getting at with it. Anything else? Yep.
You said that fire protection costs around 20 to 30%, which seems a little low considering you have to have hydrants and maintain them and all of that. I know there are communities that charge for a entity to have a fire service. Boston comes to mind. Does that money go back into the enterprise account, or can it go to the general fund?
It does. It's generally the water fund, the water department would charge the general fund of the city of town. It would come back in as water revenues to the enterprise fund, if there is an enterprise fund, and stay in there, whether it's public or private fire protection. Somebody else? Yeah.
My name's Paul Lowenstein. I come from Sharon,
Yep, hi, Paul.
and our town is about 90% residential. What we do is we have very steeply ascending block water rates. Our water use has declined from about 600 million gallons a year to about 460 million gallons a year, despite rising population since the 1990s. A lot of that is attributable, I think, to our steeply ascending block water rates, which also have a seasonal component. Each of the 4 blocks increases in summer and then decreases in winter. So we have kind of a combination approach. Recently, we've been discussing the fixed base fee, which we increased from $15 a quarter to $20 a quarter last year. And there's a great deal of controversy about the stabilizing effect of fixed base fees. And there are sort of 2 philosophies. One is to increase the fixed base fee to stabilize the revenues. And the other way to stabilize revenues would be simply to increase each block rate by an equal amount, say add $1 per 1,000 gallons to each of the 4 blocks, which would automatically have a stabilizing effect because it would apply to all water sold. And I just wanted to ask you about the relative benefit, let's say, of just increasing all the blocks as opposed to increasing the fixed base for rate stabilization.
Sure, good question. And, you know, when I saw you, Paul, I should have remembered Sharon was one of the other communities that has a seasonal rate. And I think the seasonality of Sharon's rates probably has a lot to do with the reduction in consumption that you've seen in Sharon, along with the public discussions about it and the awareness people have with it. Let me see if I can answer it this way. Increasing the rates $1 each for each block, that type of thing, would probably have some positive impact. But to a degree, a large amount of what you're going to get with customer reaction, water conservation, has to do with what they think. How many people in the room think they pay more than $2 a day for water and sewer? Okay, you guys all know that's the problem. Most people out there think water and sewer is really expensive, in part because they get their bill quarterly and they think it's a monthly bill, and that's what I pay every month, and they don't realize that's only a quarterly bill. Part of the problem is water is so relatively cheap for what it's worth, what its value is. All those people that raised their hands when I said, have you been without water for 24 hours, would gladly pay more than $1 or $2 a day. They'd gladly pay $10, $15, $20 for that day they didn't have water to have it. I know that I've been without water a number of times, and we would all pay much more for water. And the actual cost of the bill, I think, is somewhat difficult, and frankly, I think water's priced way below what it should cost. I think, if I had a magic wand and I was the emperor, and none of you will ever hire me again after saying this, and I realize that, I think everybody's rate should probably be 10 times what they are for water to more reflect what the true value of water is. Having said that, however, the issue really with water conservation is, unless you're a really big user, like Andy pointed out, where you've got a very big water bill, your bill is small, and you might read about the 20% rate increase in the local paper and say, oh, gee, I better put a brick in my toilet. People from my age would understand what that means. We used to put bricks in our toilet before low flush toilets to cut back on water consumption. But people would read about that, cut back on their water consumption. Oh gosh, the council, the selectmen just increased the water rates a lot. I better cut back on my consumption. Then they start getting their bill and going, oh gosh, it's a quarter of my electric bill. It's not that big a deal. The toilet doesn't flush that well, and you take the brick out. And that's sort of what seems to happen, in part because water is so inexpensive. Now it's changing. Water's increasing, and sewer, the cost of water and sewer are increasing at about twice the rate of inflation. So there is that growing difference, and it's starting to matter to people. Certainly read about it in Detroit, what was happening there. So it's starting to get to be there. I think you'd probably get some reduction, Paul, whether it would last or not. Probably be more dependent on what happens with the weather in the summer and perhaps the economy and how people feel about whether they can pay the bill. To the extent that the town can find other ways of stabilizing revenues than fixed charges. A lot of towns have large reserve funds in their enterprise funds that they're keeping for the rainy summers, is another way of doing it. I know when I was on a board in the town I was in, my reserves were 100% of my budget. I know that's a lot, but I was on the board and I could decide that, so I did. But we had a lot of money, and if people cut back on usage, I didn't lose any sleep because we had all that money in the bank. Let me quickly, I'm going to wrap up quickly, so we've got to get to Keith here. We will be around all day. Enterprise funds, I just wanted to mention quickly, I think they're important. All the finance directors in here are going to be mad at me that don't have enterprise funds are going to be mad at me for saying it. But the enterprise funds are essentially what they are is a way to identify your costs of water and sewer, all of your costs, show them to the town, be it town meeting, town council, city council, what those costs are, and where you're getting the money to pay for it. And most cities and towns do it. There's certainly encouragement to do it. The new Infrastructure Act that went in has language that if you don't have an enterprise fund, you're not going to get priority points, or you may not even get subsidized or low-interest loans. Let me thank you, and I'll be here for questions later, and turn it back over to you, Joe, or to Keith? Okay.